It's Sunday, May 28, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work and get exclusive access to bonus content at patreon.com/5minutenews. Joining us today is the former Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and co-host of the Clean Up on Aisle 45 podcast. Peter Strzok, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Anthony, great to be with you.
So we last spoke in January, Peter, and a lot has happened since then, obviously, and I want to kind of go through some of the biggest stories of this week. A little bit later, we're going to talk about Ron DeSantis, or Rob DeSantis, or Rob DeSanctimonious, as Trump is now calling him. He said he will pardon the January 6 rioters and Donald Trump if he becomes president, so we'll take a look at that. Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the far-right Oathkeepers group, has been sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the attack, so that's certainly a very big story this week. But I want to start with the former special counsel John Durham, who is scheduled to testify before a House committee next month about his recently completed report on the FBI's investigation of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Now, you were central to much of that. In fact, I think you get a mention in the report here and there, don't you? So
I do, yeah.
Let's just go back a little bit and talk about how the Durham report differs to the Mueller report, the timing of the Durham report versus the Mueller report, and why the Durham report came about in the first place. I'll let you explain.
Yeah, well, Anthony, that's a great question. And if you're listening tonight and saying, I have no idea what that report is, you can't be blamed, because the fact of the matter was when the FBI investigated Russia's attacks on the elections of 2016, in the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of Special Counsel Mueller prosecuting a number of people successfully and putting them in jail, there were a host of people who went to investigate the investigators. There's DOJ's Inspector General, who looked both at the Clinton investigation as well as the what was called Crossfire Hurricane was the name of the investigation into Russia's attacks on the 2016 election. But then the House and the Senate, between the intelligence committees, the judiciary committees, did their own reviews. Jeff Sessions and then Bill Barr brought in a number of prosecutors, from John Durham to Jeff Jensen to John Huber, all who were looking at various aspects of this. And the last, John Durham, was very much, Donald Trump was convinced, in every opportunity he had to talk about the witch hunt, he was, telling anybody who would listen that there was nothing to what Russia did in 2016. There was nothing to what anybody in his campaign or on his staff did, notwithstanding the fact that his campaign managers, deputy campaign managers, national security advisors, foreign policy advisor, his personal attorney, his personal fixer were all prosecuted successfully. That nevertheless, he thought there was some sort of ill doing by the FBI, by the deep state. And so Bill Barr brought in John Durham, who was a career prosecutor, to get to the truth of why this was opened. And they were convinced.
This was on Trump's instruction, right? So Trump basically says to Bill Barr, who he treated as his personal attorney, let alone kind of separate department, let's clear this Russia thing up once and for all. So Bill Barr is basically doing Donald Trump's dirty work.
That's right. And essentially it's that, it is not only investigating the investigators, but it's doing it in a way, it's a political hatchet job, right? I mean, he was doing it both to punish the people who investigated him, as well as, frankly, send a shot across the bow of the FBI and anybody else, saying essentially, if you dare to investigate me or anybody related to me or close to me, I'm going to come at you. And in fact, that's what John Durham did. He spent 4 years, from 2019 until just last month, going around the world, flying, on the Attorney General's personal jet to Italy, to the United Kingdom, and all over the place, tracking down these cockamamie theories, which ended up with nothing. And so at the end of the day, we have a very, in my opinion, a clearly partisan report that twists evidence, that omits evidence. But at the end of the day, the things that he finds are no different from what the Inspector General found, again, back in 2019. So there is nothing new here. The things that were, there were clearly problems. The FBI had some real issues with a FISA, with a wiretap that they targeted against, a certain individual. That was found by the Inspector General. Those things were addressed. And there wasn't much new. Durham tried, he brought charges against an FBI attorney, again, that the Inspector General had found, got him to plead out. And then Durham himself brought 2 cases criminally, which were, after multiple weeks of trial, were rapidly acquitted. In fact, in the first case, one of the jurors said, I don't know why he's wasting our time. So the concern, is, well, one, was this a serious endeavor? It was not. It was very much something that Bill Barr did to appease President Trump. And at the end of this, we have something that is, when you read it, it reads like a far right-wing screed of theories about what the deep state did in coordination with Hillary Clinton. And the reason you may not have heard about it is most people in the media aren't covering it because it is sort of nonsense. If you turn on, Fox News perhaps, or some of the, the far right media ecosphere, you might hear about it. But for the most part, I think people looked at it, assessed it to be sort of a partisan editorial, and just moved on.
It's a shame that the media didn't do the same with Donald Trump throughout his presidency, just treat it as, something that wasn't to be taken seriously. The problem, though, is that Donald Trump is using the Durham Report as a weapon against the left. He put out a pretty scary video on Thursday where he was seething and was talking about retribution and all of the stuff that he's going to do if he wins the presidency once again. In investigating everybody, and he's really going to kind of weaponize every branch of government, more so than he did before. I mean, you could argue he has become more enthused, more crazy, more fascist, as someone described. And so he's waving the Durham Report in a way to say, as he did when Bill Barr kind of rewrote the Mueller report, paraphrased it, and got up and said, Trump's exonerated, and then Trump kind of waved a newspaper and said he'd been exonerated. He's doing the same with the Durham Report, isn't he? It's very useful to him because people don't read it, so they take his word for it.
Right, absolutely. And what's really concerning, look, attorney generals are political by nature. They're appointed by the president. There's some expectation that at that level, you're going to have somebody that has a partisan agenda. And, whether Democrat or Republican, that's going to be the case. Now, some folks are more extreme than others. Certainly, I think Bill Barr, as an attorney general, was the most corrupting attorney general that DOJ has had, certainly in living memory and perhaps, in the history of the office. But below that, folks who are career prosecutors, John Durham came into this a very respected U.S. attorney. He had, investigated the FBI up in Boston and the relationship between some agents in the FBI and Whitey Bulger, who was an organized criminal in the Boston area, did that for a number of years. He investigated the CIA's destruction of tapes that they had made in the fight on the global war on terror as part of the rendition, detention, interrogation program. So he had engaged in the past in very high-profile investigations and had the reputation of being kind of an even-keeled, thorough prosecutor. But in this case, he just, I don't know why and I don't know how, but under sort of Bill Barr's corrupting influence, he started chasing and believing some of these extraordinarily partisan, like Italian space laser type theories, not that specifically, but things that so strain credulity that most people who would look at that would say, oh, no, that theory is nonsense, or this theory is nonsense. But nevertheless, again, 4 years and almost $10 million of taxpayer money later, we've got 2 failed prosecutions and, a 300-page editorial. So it does serve Trump. It does serve his narrative. I think, Trump doesn't hide things. Trump tells you who he is. Trump tells you what he's going to do. Trump absolutely will go up to the line and see how far he can get beyond it until he is prevented from doing so. And if he gets 5 feet, he'll try for a 6. If he gets 50 feet, he'll try for 55. And so what he saw in his first administration, and the fact that he still has yet to, we may start getting a federal charge here too, but he knows what he got away with the last time. And I have every expectation he's just going to turn that up if he gets back in the White House. And he's being very clear. He's not hiding that. He's talking about giving, loyalty tests, what he's calling citizenship tests to every government employee, right? That if you're working for the U.S. government, take this test with questions written by Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, God knows who else, and you have to pass it. Now, it's not going to be out of some civics textbook from high school or college. It's going to be written by people in the White House. He has threatened to take away the security clearances of thousands of people who may not agree with him. So what is he going to do? Look at the entire U.S. intelligence community, find the registered Democrats, and pull their security clearance? That's what he's saying he's going to do. So I think we have to take him at his word, because he's proven in the past that he is willing to do all the things that he's saying. And these scary videos when he is telling the population, I am your retribution, when he's playing, at his rallies, music from the January 6th choir, which is a choir made up of inmates, of those people who are awaiting trial for January 6th and who are so violent and who represent such a threat to the community that they're in prison waiting trial. Their choir is what he's playing at his campaign rallies to open it up. So yes, we need to be concerned. Yes, this report is a helpful tool for him to continue this narrative of being attacked and aggrieved. And I have every expectation that he's going to continue referencing it as we head into 2024.
When it comes to Russia, do you think that Donald Trump believes that he's innocent? Or do you think that he is, because I sometimes think people say to me, oh, why does he lie all the time? And I've started to say, well, I don't think he does lie all the time. He tells his truth. He lives in this Donald Trump bubble. And as far as he's concerned, because he doesn't have the intellect to understand how Russia operates and how they may have, put a target on his back a decade ago or even longer, He feels like he is innocent, and therefore all of this Russia stuff he refers to as a hoax because he doesn't really know anything about it, despite his very public secret meetings with Vladimir Putin at public events where he doesn't let anybody else in the room. So what's going on with Donald Trump and his kind of Russia relationship? Does he genuinely believe that he is innocent and it's all a hoax, or is he just playing a long game?
That's a great question. I don't think the extreme of he is wittingly engaged in a clandestine relationship with Russia where they're telling him to do something. My gut is that isn't the case. I certainly think there are things in the past and currently that he does not want known about things he has done with the Russians, whether that's conversations with Vladimir Putin, whether that's things he did in a business context in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000 timeframe. I think there are things he's done with other countries. Certainly the Saudis pop to mind, but other countries around the world that he would not like known. And so the question is then, well, why doesn't he want it known? Probably because it would be either embarrassing or his perception, it would be damaging to him. So, what are those things? But, does he see that as, I don't want it known because I think it's wrong? Or does he see it as, I don't want it known simply because somebody's going to try and attack me with it?
Because the PP tape shouldn't be a thing for him. He should be excited about that, if anything. You know what I mean? Like, that's a badge of honor to him, this compromat. So I can't see that would be something that would worry him. I mean, he's not worried about paying off a porn star or the Access Hollywood tape. Those things didn't seem to bother him. So the what goes on in a Russian hotel is irrelevant, right?
Yeah, but yet his denial of it is what gives it the power. I mean, you could say the same thing about, the Trump Tower in Moscow. Who, at the end of the day, who cares? He was pursuing Trump Tower in Azerbaijan. There are Trump Towers, all around the world. And so why would he not simply say during the 2016 campaign, sure, I'm pursuing a deal with Russia. I'm a businessman. I'm a real estate person. I've got these deals all around the world. I think my sense is he knew that people were looking at his relationship with Russia and asking some hard questions. He probably had some things, not necessarily that deal, but there were other things that he didn't want known. And so he, in his mind, said, I've got to stay away from any association with Russia because that is going to be used to attack me. So he said, no, I've got no business dealings with Russia. When in fact, Michael Cohen was at that moment interacting with Russian individuals trying to get a deal done. And then the issue, of course, with that is, the minute he says that, he's lied, right? And the American public takes him at his word. But the people in Russia know, wait a minute, he just lied about this. We know full well there's Michael Cohen and all the email going back and forth. And that gives them leverage over him, saying, all right, Don, and they don't need to say this because he's spent his entire career leaving unsaid what should and must be left unsaid. Their ability, if they wanted to go and call the Washington Post or call up ABC News and say, oh, hey, look, yesterday he said he had no dealings with Russia, but in fact, we're going to send you all the email we've been having back and forth with Michael Cohen. So that gives those Russian entities leverage over him the minute he lies about it. So those are the sorts of things. And it's not just, and take Russia and then repeat it every place that might be going on, particularly overseas. I mean, there might be domestic entities, but I'm not, as a counterintelligence guy, I'm worried about foreign nations. Those are the things that give national security concerns, right? Those are the things that, as a national security professional, you sit there and say, well, okay, what this hidden leverage by foreign entities, foreign nations, how does Trump put the interests of the national security of the United States ahead of his own personal interests when he has these personal vulnerabilities? And that conflict, I mean, that was the concern for the 4 years of his presidency. That's the continuing concern if he goes back in the White House. What conditions came with the Saudi money that, the $2 billion that went to Jared Kushner? What conditions came with the Saudi money that, went into the LIV golf tournament and all the, the venues at Trump properties? All the other countries that, the Jack Smith, this current special counsel, asked for, subpoenaed the Trump organization for records of deals with, I think, 5 or 7 countries, from Turkey to France to China to Saudi Arabia to Oman. I mean, it was a very interesting group of countries. So, those questions are out there. Again, I don't think there is nothing between his presidency, between the way Trump has managed all the sort of Mar-a-Lago document, which he may soon face federal charges, that whole process. There's nothing that gives me any hope or expectation that if he returns to the White House, that he's going to approach the national security of the United States with the seriousness that it deserves. And if anything, he'd play it even more fast and loose than he did the first time around.
And that very first meeting, it's probably worth just referencing that very first meeting when the FBI showed up at Trump Tower to warn, this was the day that he'd won the presidency. Before the inauguration, he'd won the presidency, and they came and they warned him that Russia had potentially meddled in the election, and this is something that he, as president-elect, should know about. His reaction to that was very interesting, wasn't it? Because anybody else would have gone, "You're kidding, this is serious." But he was grateful for the support, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And I mean, there are a lot of things in that meeting that were odd. He, between not saying, I don't want, nobody, myself included, should have any sort of support or hindrance from a foreign nation. We need to make this a purely domestic exercise. That wasn't the statement out of his mouth. When Director Comey talked to him about some of the allegations in the Steele material, in particular, the Moscow hotel room where allegedly prostitutes were there, he said, it wasn't denying the episode at all. It was like, there weren't prostitutes. I don't need to pay for things like that. I'm too big and important and popular. So there are a bunch of weird things. And, and we saw it. That was the first impeachment, right? I mean, that was telling Zelensky, I'll help you. I will provide you defensive aid to prevent a Russian invasion, but you need to do me a favor. You need to go investigate my rival. And then even after that, in his comments to reporters, I think on the South Lawn of the White House, it called on President Xi in China to do the same thing. So there's no barrier, I think, in his mind to the idea of engaging and accepting the assistance of foreign nations to help him gain and maintain power. And the United States has never had a president like that, just openly expressing those sorts of requests and, encouragement, frankly.
Can I just ask your opinion about Ukraine for a moment, just off on a bit of a tangent, because, Trump, and DeSantis is doing it as well now, claims that he could sort out this whole war in 1 or 2 phone calls. Well, we know what that's going to be. It's going to be a phone call to Putin and a phone call to Zelensky, and he's going to say to Putin, okay, you can have this much land, and Zelensky, this is what you've got to be happy with. I mean, what's the deal here? Because I believe, and I actually blame Donald Trump for this war. I think that his relationships with Russia and the way he ran the US on the world stage very much kind of are the reason that this war happened, or part of the reason that this war happened. Can you just explain that to people? Because I don't think it's very easy to make the correlation between, Trump being the instigator for Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you go back to the, even in early late 15, early 16, when the Republican National Committee platform was being hammered out, there was a lot of jostling and jockeying about what the platform would say vis-a-vis Ukraine and toning down the language in terms of giving Ukraine defensive weapons at the time. And that was really watered down. And then you had Trump throughout his presidency signaling that, he was not going to push back against Putin very strongly. He was constantly questioning the value of NATO, whether or not the U.S., when he was on the campaign trail, he made statements about, I don't know whether or not that the United States would honor its mutual defense obligations to NATO if NATO were attacked. So from even before he was president, he was saying things that were deeply undermining of the NATO relationship and of broadly the United States relationship with Western Europe and the EU. And that continued when he was in the presidency. And if certainly, most famously, of course, telling Zelensky, conditioning aid, defensive aid, on a political favor, specifically against Biden. And I think Putin saw this, and people say, well, Putin didn't invade, right? Well, he didn't need to. I mean, he had Crimea at the time, but the things that Putin was achieving just by having Trump in power, I think the question was when he left, how much the Europeans, after 4 years of Trump, felt they could or could not count on the U.S. for assistance. And then certainly you're right, to the extent that after they've gone in, there is any proposal to solve Ukraine in 24 hours. The only way you're going to do that is by telling Ukraine, you have to accept giving up some territory, not just Crimea, but other territory, because there's no other way that Putin's going to settle for that. So I think what's interesting in this is certainly there is so much writing from a Russian perspective, but also, frankly, from a Ukrainian one, so much writing on this next election that I expect to see the amount of interference and activity that we're going to see out of Russia, to some extent Ukraine, but Russia has many more resources in this regard, from intelligence operations, from sort of disinformation and perception management type activities. It is hugely in Putin's interest to get Trump and or DeSantis, who are parroting this line about solving the problem in 24 hours, hugely in their interest to elect the Republican candidate, assuming it's one of the two of them. So as we get closer and closer to the election in 2024, I fully expect to see a very vigorous and active Russian campaign to try and influence the election, to get the person into the presidency who are going to allow them to solve the Ukraine conflict in terms favorable to Russia.
In Trump's scary video on Thursday, he kind of finished with a piece about how the 2024 election was already being weaponized by the Democrats and how they were already cheating. And he was, again, sowing the seeds of disinformation misinformation about the 2024 election. I mean, this is what he does, right? He, if he doesn't win, it must be fraud. That's, him and Carrie Lake, they're kind of made for each other. So, I mean, how dangerous is that? Because for me as a European, like seeing someone who is as dangerous as Donald Trump, still a free man, right? Despite the investigations, despite 2 impeachments, despite the sexual abuse case, still a free man. Nothing sticks to this guy. The language that he was using in that video, and I'll show a clip of it.
The Russia hoax was the most atrocious weaponization of our government in American history. As the Durham Report makes clear, it was a crime like no other. 7 years ago, I ran for office, taking on all of the corrupt forces who got rich, bleeding America dry. They got absolutely rich, so rich you wouldn't even believe it. Our agenda was a threat to the entire political establishment. In response, a group of unelected thugs in the senior ranks of our government, working with crooked Hillary Clinton, launched a coup attempt to try and sabotage our campaign, our presidency, our movement, and our country. Crooked Hillary and Crooked Joe Biden. We switched names now. We call Hillary Lovely Hillary and Crooked Joe because we've seen so much. And James Comey and Andrew McCabe, Barack Hussein Obama, all of them and all of the rest knew that it was a lie, a total lie. It was a scam. The entire time was all a big hoax. And they put our country through hell. The destruction, the the Russia hoax caused to America is almost incalculable. It subverted our democracy, it weaponized our law enforcement, it stoked global conflict, and it wrecked countless lives. It provided the pretext for the left's war on our freedom of speech. Worst of all, the FBI and the DOJ, both very corrupt, have interfered in every election since 2016, and now they are interfering in the 2024 presidential election before your very eyes. There must be a reckoning. For better or worse, accountability for these crimes lies in the hands of the voters. The Durham Report has made the stakes very clear, and now the choices are as either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state. With your vote, we will remove this cancerous culture of corruption from our government, and we will purge these criminals from the halls of power once and for all. Our country is in serious trouble. We can't let this happen. Thank you very much.
So vitriolic, and yet, you know, he's becoming a monster. If he wasn't already, he is like, it's coming out of every one of those giant pores on his orange face. And yet there's nothing America seems to do about it because of this First Amendment right to say whatever you want about the country or about the opposition. Or, I mean, it just makes no sense to me that he is allowed as a future president and a past president to be speaking in this type of language.
Yeah, well, I think his extremism certainly is getting worse. The Washington Post a few days ago published an article comparing some of his statements now versus the same time prior to the 2016 election. And his rhetoric, the positions he is taking on various issues is dramatically different, is dramatically more aggressive and extreme now than it was at this time in 2015 and early 2016. So I think there is little question that his position on things has gotten more extreme, has gotten more anti-democratic. And to your point about, yes, he is absolutely setting up the election as something that's going to be unfair. And that miserable, horribly staged CNN town hall where they filmed the audience full of whooping, cheering Trump supporters, he refused to say that he would honor the results of the 2024 election. Then he said, well, if it was fair, I'll honor it. But if not, well, I don't know. But he, of course, is setting up that anything where he doesn't win is going to be unfair. And so seeding that doubt now, it is, you know, there's a two-part choice. One, he wins and it was a free and fair election, or two, he loses, whether by 10 votes or 10 million votes or 100 million votes, and it was rigged. And so there is not a state, I cannot envision in his mind any sort of election where he does not win that he also believes is fair. And you see that now in just the constant repetition. And as you mentioned, you know, like Kerry Lake, he's starting early. And this is, you know, sitting there and, you know, one, it's seeding the propaganda. Two, it's also an effort to pull back. He knows where his voting demographic is and isn't. And that's why you're seeing, you know, the continued attempts at, you know, voting disenfranchisement, making it harder, you know, inner cities and, you know, some states, you know, swing states that making it harder and harder for urban areas to vote. You're seeing attempts to take away voting locations around campuses where younger demographics vote so that students can't walk across campus to vote. They have to somehow get on a bus and go 2 miles to get to a polling place. These are going hand in glove. On the one hand, decreasing confidence amongst his supporters about whether or not the vote's fair. At the same time, taking very real measures within state legislatures and at a state level to make it harder for his opponents to vote. And again, all of this is horribly anti-democratic. All of this is authoritarian in nature, and he is embracing it without any hesitation.
He's been very specific about policies for the first time, really. You know, he's not really a policy guy, but now obviously the millers behind the scenes are kind of coming up with language in education, and he wants the permitless carry to carry over state borders, various things that again will kind of set America up for a civil war if it wanted one, and that's very much, I feel, what he really wants. Is he wants chaos. He wants to create chaos. Bannon talked about this years ago. throwing so much information out there that nobody knows what to think. People don't know what is up and what is down. And through that chaos, people like Trump, have success. I am worried that he could be successful in 2024, not because of his policies necessarily, but because of the way that the Electoral College is set up, the way that the gerrymandering goes. There are lots of mechanisms in a system that is really designed to favor Republican candidates. I mean, there is a small chance that he could win, and that is the America we will get.
Yeah, I do. I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. First, I think he is very much, he does want, in my opinion, there's two, he either wants complete control or he wants chaos. So it is not, I mean, yes, I think he wants chaos. I think he wants to see things burn down if he is not the one in charge. And I think we saw that early on January 6th. He didn't want to call off the mobs because he liked the fact that, he had lost and they were burning everything to the ground. I don't think he wants that chaos if he perceives that he can be in charge. I mean, there it's fine. I mean, he wants the adulation that, Kim Jong-un gets and that, Erdogan gets in Turkey. He wants the appeal of the dictator to have the big parades. He wants a May Day parade in Washington, D.C. He wants the trappings of everybody telling him he's great with the tanks and the planes and everybody cheering. So, that's one aspect of it. But then the other thing, when it comes to the vote, I mean, I do have some hope. There are so many issues out there from, the Dobbs decision, which was a Supreme Court recent decision talking about the access to women to abortion, greatly restricting that. I think there are a number of issues that the swing voter does not support that is very much a core component of what Trump and the Republican Party is embracing right now. And I think there's a great deal of vulnerabilities for the Republicans right now. One, I think, MAGA Nation, that 20, 30 million people might never change their vote, but a lot of suburban, the swing voters, the traditionally a little bit conservative, maybe white collar suburban voters are going to look at the reproductive right restrictions. They're going to look at gun violence. I mean, for God's sakes, it's okay to have kindergartners doing gun drills in their classroom, but the same people get horribly offended if they walk in with a rainbow T-shirt because that's somehow supporting LGBTQ rights. I mean, you're offended. You're offended at a T-shirt, but you're not offended about the fact that there's such a routine level of gun violence in America that we're having 5-year-olds practice what to do if there's an active shooter. I mean, these are the things that I think the people that are going to determine the outcome of the 2024 election, that is ultimately what they're going to care about. And in most cases, the sort of balance sheet of those issues, I think heavily weigh against Trump and the positions that he's taking. I mean, I hope so. Because I just can't. I can't, at the end of the day, look at some of these core issues that have immediate impact on people's lives.
But you're thinking logically, you're thinking.
Yeah, and I thought this. We all thought, yeah, right. Yeah, we all thought the same thing in 2016, right?
Yeah. I mean, kind of American political history much better than me because you've been living it. But I just have the feeling that Republicans cannot bring themselves to put a check in the Democrat box. Surely they would rather not vote than give their conservative vote or their moderate vote over to Joe Biden.
Yeah, I don't look. I mean, the midterm elections in 2022 were supposed to produce this red wave that was going to flip the House and Senate decisively to the Republicans. It didn't flip anything on the Senate, which was a huge red flag for Republicans. And frankly, what the Republicans enjoy a razor-thin margin in the House. So all of these people, and when you look at where the expected gains were that never materialized, a huge chunk of those were people that were endorsed by Trump and Trump supporters. So I think when push comes to shove, at least at a state level, whether that's state congressmen or senators, I think there is a lot of hesitation for the average American to jump on board with Trump. And I do think the sort of fatigue, what I worry about is, if you had another election in 2021 or 2022, Trump was still fresh enough that people would look and say, oh, God, no, that was terrible. We don't need to go back to that. That was horribly destructive. Enough time has passed that people, and you even see it in the mainstream media in the United States, people sort of the normalization of Trump, treating him like an average candidate, ignoring and forgetting the fact that he encouraged a violent insurrection to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, unlike anything since the Civil War, that somehow, well, CNN, let's bring him in. Let's have a big, kind of bunch of softballs. Well, the Caitlin Collins, the reporter, tried to push back, but, in the face of, 50 screaming, cheering, whoop it up Trump fans, had the deck stacked against her. So there is, I worry, a short memory that lends itself to a normalization of Trump's current behavior and absolutely tends to forget just how horrific his presidency was. And, as we were saying earlier, every indication from what he's saying will be much worse in terms of anti-democratic initiatives in the future.
We have to take a quick pause for our sponsor message, but we'll come back with more from Peter Strzok in just a moment. Maybe you're like me and you sometimes struggle with what to wear, finding pieces that go together and the hassle maybe of changing clothes for different activities. Well, Rhone's Commuter Collection is the most comfortable, breathable and flexible set of products. Commuter Collection offers the world's most comfortable clothes. You never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rhone Commuter Collection. And with Rhone's wrinkle release technology, wrinkles disappear as you stretch and wear the products. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can ditch the dry cleaner altogether. I personally love feeling fresh. I love a technical fabric, and that makes me kind of confident knowing that the clothes are looking after themselves. Well, the Commuter Collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. Head to rhone.com/weekendshow and use promo code weekendshow to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to Rhone, RHONE.com/weekendshow and use code weekendshow. It's time to find your corner office comfort. Our next partner is Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens literally every day. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted better gut health, boosted energy, immune system support, and wanted a supplement that actually tastes great. I take AG1 in the morning before starting my day, and it makes me feel unstoppable and ready to take on the day. I'm doing something good for my body, like I'm giving my body the nutrition that it craves, and I'm covering my nutritional bases. Now, I've tried a ton of different supplements out there, but this is different, and the ingredients are super high quality. Very quickly, I noticed that it improved my energy and made me feel great. AG1 makes it easier for you to take the highest quality supplements, period. Just one daily serving covers my day's nutritional bases and supports my long-term gut health with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients. It's one scoop of powder mixed with water once a day. AG1 is a really seamless and easy daily habit to maintain. I'm asked all the time about the one thing I'd do to take care of my health if I could pick only one, and this is it. AG1 by Athletic Greens. I can't think of another daily routine that pays off as well as AG1, which is why I trust the product so much. If you're looking for an easier way to take supplements, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/weekendshow. That's athleticgreens.com/weekendshow. Check it out. Stuart Rhodes, founder of the far-right Oathkeepers group, has been sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the attack on the US Capitol. It's the longest sentence handed down so far to any participant in the January 6th insurrection, when thousands of Trump supporters stormed the halls of Congress to stop the certification of Joe Biden's presidential victory. I mean, the fact that I'm saying that out loud is just beggars belief, right? Like this stuff actually happened. And it seems like, American history, in comparison to this, obviously 9/11 was like a kind of monolithic experience for American people and those of us around the world. But the insurrection really is kind of that next blip in the line, isn't it, in terms of kind of domestic events. 18 years for Stuart Rhodes. That's it's a decent sentence considering it wasn't his idea. wasn't his plan. It was Donald Trump. I mean, if Donald Trump didn't want to overturn the election and bring about a coup, Stuart Rhodes wouldn't have been anywhere near the Capitol. So I'm not defending Stuart Rhodes for a moment, Peter, but isn't Stuart Rhodes taking Donald Trump's time when he didn't do the crime?
Well, I think he's doing the appropriate time that he deserves. I mean, I completely agree that Stuart Rhodes would not have been in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, but for Trump's encouragement to come. So, this is the chain of causality goes up to Donald Trump, but that doesn't absolve those folks below him who were part of that effort to, pay the consequences of their actions. And that, it absolutely, I can't think since 9/11 of a more sort of severe shock to the system. But of course, 9/11 was an external threat. I mean, and this January 6th was an internal one. So when you talk in terms of gravity, I mean, the 3,000+ people who were killed on September 11th will never leave Americans' minds and memories. But at the end of the day, after that tragic loss of life, when America turned its efforts on al-Qaeda, that was absolutely the pursuit of al-Qaeda across the globe and pursuing the global war on terrorism. That was something very much that, America had the upper hand. I mean, we never, thank God and knock on wood, didn't see any subsequent attack anywhere near that scale, and hopefully we never will. The difference with January 6th, of course, is that isn't somebody, working in the tribal territory of Afghanistan or Pakistan. This is something coming from within the United States, all across the United States. And not since the Civil War has America faced anything of this magnitude. And so, 18 years is a very long time. I know, comparing it, my experience certainly looking to European sentences and other, sentences of incarceration, America tends to have elevated lengths in my experience, but 18, in my opinion, was low. I mean, the guidelines, which sort of lay out the expected sentence, the minimum was 20, and the government had asked for 25. And the judge, after just excoriating Rhodes, gave him a sentence of 18 years. Now, the reality is Rhodes, I think, is in his late 50s. By the time he's eligible to leave prison, he'll be in his early mid-70s. So depending on how long he lives, this is effectively close to a life sentence. But this is what he did was, seditious conspiracy, and short of treason, there is very little in the sort of like the laws of the United States more severe than what he did. So, I think, 18 years probably, frankly, wasn't enough, but certainly was merited.
And the crime was heard as a terrorist crime, right? He was tried as a terrorist. Do you think people understand the threat of domestic terrorism enough? Because as you say, the foreign threats now have dissipated somewhat. Obviously, everyone has an eye on Russia and China and North Korea. But those domestic terrorists, they look like you and I. And there is a kind of racial prejudice in America, that the white people are safe. Well, all of the people, or the majority of the people that have been tried in the January 6th were white people that look like you and I, and yet they have committed arguably some of the most serious crimes against their own country.
Yeah, well, there's no question in my mind that the short answer is no. I don't think people appreciate enough to what an extent this represents a terrorist-type behavior, and was terrorist-type behavior in the past. It was a terrorism enhancement, so without diving deep down into the legal system of the sentencing guidelines, the charge itself was not one of terrorism, but within the sentencing guidelines, sort of an aggravating factor, which the government successfully argued was this idea of linking it to terrorism, and the judge agreed, so that bumped it up. But I do think, I agree with you. I think a tremendous amount of this is rooted in past white supremacist ideas going back to the Civil War and before that. I do think there's very much, like, people have called Stuart Rhodes an anti-government extremist. Well, he's not anti-government. He had no beef with Donald Trump. He had no complaint about Donald Trump. He said in his sentencing before the judge, his argument that, look, I tried to help Trump supporters. So his issue is not with the government. His issue is with Democrats. And so, kind of having grown up overseas, but look at, you look at like, Palestine or Lebanon or something, you talk about, well, Hamas, and then you talk about, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or somebody, what we would call, radical, violent, militant groups of the the Palestinian statehood movement or something. This is Stuart Rhodes and the Oathkeepers have become a radical, violent militia of the Republican Party. I mean, frankly, that's the truth, right? They are completely fine with Donald Trump and going after Antifa, or what they perceive to be Antifa, the Black Lives Matter protesters in the summer of 2020. The only people they have a problem with, though, are on the left. And so this is this phenomena of people who are advancing a political agenda, which is specific to one party, and willing to engage in violence to advance that agenda. It's terrorism, as most definitions of terrorism go. Now, in the United States, it gets really complicated very quickly because the First Amendment protects political speech, and there are things that you can do that are hateful and awful, and you can say terrible things about minorities or certain religious groups or certain sexual orientation, and that's protected by the First Amendment. So it gets very muddy very quickly at where that line is between what, the catchphrase is lawful but awful, and then where it crosses the line into prohibited behavior. But clearly, I think what we saw out of these Oathkeeper successful prosecutions is when it comes to attempting to violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power, that is violence in the name of a political agenda. I don't care. I mean, that is terrorism. And I challenge anybody to convince me otherwise.
I would just say that where I'm from, there is a difference between hate speech and free speech. And we don't call it the First Amendment. It's a free country, and you can speak freely. But the moment it goes into hate speech, that's against the law. And, you will be dealt with appropriately. And people do understand that. And it's actually got worse. I often reference the UK. I haven't lived there for 7 years. I often reference the UK. And people now write to me and they're like, it's not like that anymore. It's, it is worse. We do have a lot of similar problems to the US. I just want to reference something that Stuart Rhodes said when his sentence was handed down. He said, "I'm a political prisoner, and like President Trump, my only crime is opposing those who are destroying our country." What do you think he means by that?
Well, I think it means it tells you exactly where his mindset is at. He also compared himself during that same colloquy in front of the judge to, said, "I am America's Alexander Solzhenitsyn," or words to that effect. I mean, he clearly views not only that somehow the democratic process in the United States has become corrupted, which is not the case, and that Donald Trump is the true leader and should be the president right now and is the only path forward, which is also not the case. But he's fully unrepentant. He is saying things and set things up through his sentencing yesterday that there was no remorse. There was no acknowledgement whatsoever that there was any reasonable choice by the American voting public that would lead to Joe Biden being elected president. And so I look at somebody again who, without any sort of remorse, believed that his actions on January 6th were appropriate and were somehow comported with his understanding of the Constitution of the United States and somehow aligned with, what American democracy is. Now, of course, that it's nonsense. It doesn't. He broke the law. That is what a unanimous jury of his peers found. That is what the judge found. And, truly just, at some point when he was sentencing him saying, you are a current threat. You are a threat to the fabric of American democracy right now. And so, that's accurate. But you have somebody, he's extraordinarily well educated. He was a serviceman in the military. He went to Yale Law School, a super prestigious American law school. So a learned man, but just completely, his notion of democracy is unlike anything, that's been seen in America before, let alone envisioned by the founding fathers.
But this is going to become a problem, isn't it? Because let's say it wasn't Stuart Rhodes that got 18 years. It was Donald Trump that got 18 years for inciting an insurrection and a coup and the overturning of the election and stealing documents and paying off a porn star and everything else. Because of these two parallel Americas, the one that you and I live in, which I like to refer to as reality, where we abide by the laws of the land and we understand that our actions have consequences. And then there's this other America where Stuart Rhodes, the reason he showed no remorse is he is convinced that he is right. Donald Trump is convinced that he is the legitimate president. These people are living in a parallel universe. And if it did come to the point that Donald Trump does get a serious sentence handed down, I can't really imagine him being incarcerated, but I could imagine him being in some kind of house arrest at Mar-a-Lago. That is going to cause chaos. You're going to have, you described 30 million people. I mean, if it is anything close to that, that is going to be a huge number of people causing upset. Forget the BLM protests. I mean, this is going to cause insanity on the streets of America, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a perverse dynamic going on. And I think that the majority of the Republican Party's leadership want nothing more than for Trump to be charged, convicted, and incarcerated. So it removes the problem so that they know full well that 2022, the elections were a disaster for the Republicans. They know that, frankly, a lot of the things that Trump is saying is not likely to be a winner in the 2024 election. So they, I think, would much rather get a different candidate than Donald Trump the nomination. But the problem is they've been playing along with Trump. So you have, separate and distinct from what these, sort of the gray-haired, the elders of the Republican Party say behind closed doors at the clubs and the back rooms while sipping scotch, they know the truth, but they have gone along and allowed the development of this core of people who have no understanding of that, who truly believe that Trump is, absolutely the best thing to come along in the Republican Party in their lifetime. And so if they are able, one, and are praying to get what they're praying for, which is Trump removed as a candidate and a contender for the Republican nomination, then they've somehow still got to harness the affection and loyalty of all his followers to get whoever it is his replacement is elected to the White House. So how do you then harness, you've got to appeal to that base with the things that Trump has promised and encouraged in them. So in some ways it locks you into being a mini Trump, but nobody, Ron DeSantis doesn't have the charisma to do that. There's nobody, Asa Hutchinson isn't going to do it. Sununu none of the people that are stepping, Nikki Haley can't do that. There's nobody in the sort of slate of potential Republican alternates who can step into that role that Trump has.
But
so
Trump
then how
can, isn't that the
right,
problem?
And Trump can,
Trump
and so
can, and so that's why
and he can
they're
do it from
keeping
jail.
Sturm. Yeah,
and he probably will do it from jail. And so if he's, if he's charged, if he's awaiting trial, if he's gone through trial, whether he's at Mar-a-Lago or some low security prison with Secret Service, I have no idea how that would work. I can see for his ego, he will still try running. And so, the problem is you have created a mob. And once you've done that, as long as you have the mob leader who can speak to them from anywhere, wherever that may be, you're going to have a tough time controlling it unless you are that mob leader. So I don't, I think the Republicans tried to play too cute by half by just like Merrick Garland will take care of it for us. He may take care of some criminal charges, but that's not going to impact the political viability of Donald Trump.
The insurrection is still going on, though, isn't it, if you think about it? I mean, even the negotiations over the debt ceiling, that is still insurrectionists playing with fire because there is no negotiation to be had. The debt ceiling has to be raised. That's the deal. That's what Congress is supposed to do. The fact that they're not doing it because Donald Trump tells them not to means, as far as I see it, that Kevin McCarthy and the negotiators and certainly some of these smaller characters as well, even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who seems to have been given a starring role in this new Congress, they are still insurrectionists and they are continuing to just roll on from January 6 by holding the country and the world economy hostage.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the debt ceiling, that's been a problem for some time, even before Donald Trump yet, going back to Newt Gingrich and, certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago, the sort of notion of holding the, extending the debt ceiling is to extract political concessions is something in particular the Republicans have done for some time. So I don't know. That it's awful and it's terrible and it ought not happen. And we need to find a sort of legislative fix to get around this silly game of chicken that we seem to play every 2 years. But it's different
this time, isn't it? Because they will crash the economy. Whereas before everyone's like, well, of course they won't. 11th hour, they'll sort it out. But this time, there's no fear. You can see it in their eyes.
Right. I think what that goes to is because, again, ironically, because the Trump endorsed candidates in the midterm elections were so toxic that created such a thin Republican majority that gave disproportionate power to people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and all the crazies of the MAGA far right. And had it been a, sort of a wipeout of Republicans, you could afford to minimize some of those people. I mean, it took, 15, 16 votes for Kevin McCarthy to be voted in as Speaker of the House of Representatives. So I think what that close election ironically did was give a disproportionate amount of power to these wildly irresponsible, incompetent, nihilistic representatives who want nothing more than to give, a pleasing soundbite for Sean Hannity and ultimately for Donald Trump. And so you see the sort of rhetoric that is combined, again, with not the most thoughtful people. And it creates a horrible scenario, certainly for any responsible Republican, and there are responsible Republicans still, but they've got to deal with this sort of crazy far right MAGA element that, grinds any sort of responsible governance to a halt.
Let's talk about Ron DeSantis, just to wrap up, because, what he's doing in Florida. I can't get my head around whether Floridians are actually behind him or not, because it's very hard to tell. He had some success in November with his governor vote, but it's hard to tell how much of Florida really is as extreme and far right and anti-Disney and, anti-woke as he is. He's on a bit of a tour, and of course on Wednesday he announced that he will be candidate for the presidential election in 2024, certainly for the primary. So, I mean, he is Donald Trump in many ways. You could argue he's more dangerous because he is more eloquent and he is able to communicate the message, or at least get to the end of a sentence, where Donald Trump, is more scattergun. But saying that, and I just want to reference something that he said himself on Thursday. He said he would look at immediately pardoning the former president and the January 6th rioters. That if he won the White House, he said he would do it almost straight away. On day one, he said he would look at this. I mean, this is not a great alternative to Trump, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, one, he's got to say that. I mean, that's the only way he's going to have any shot at support from Trump and his supporters. And I think DeSantis will not win head-to-head against Trump, even if Trump's in jail. He does not have the charisma. He doesn't have the support. He's oddly antisocial. I know some of the commentary after he did his world tour, certainly, and the great British tabloids being what they are after he left, all these little comments about, he doesn't really have it. He doesn't, it was widely panned. So there is no scenario that I can envision where he goes head to head with Trump and wins. He's just not going to be able to do it. DeSantis's one and only bet, which he is making, is that something is going to happen to Trump, whether it is age, health, indictment, imprisonment, something where either he can't run or there's enough of a sea change where they say we have to have an alternative, and he is the top of the also-rans. Because nobody can beat Trump head-to-head. It's not going to happen. And so what you have people doing is trying to assess and say, okay, we know we can't beat Trump, but there's enough of a reasonable chance that for whatever reason, Trump is not going to be able to run. So we're essentially going to run for second place. And if you're running for second place, you've got to appeal to the Trump demographic because you've got to lock up that vote. You've got to get Trump's endorsement if he is not out there. So you've got to then play to, of course, I'm going to pardon him. I'm going to pardon all his supporters. I'm going to take all these crazy, deep state conspiracy theories. I'm going to go after the woke agenda of the communist left. And so you see a parroting of all the things that they have to say to get that Trump endorsement, because the only way that he or anybody else ends up the Republican nominee, let alone elected, is if they get that core support. But if Trump stays in, he's dead. But he is not in it to beat Trump. He's in it to be the head of the pack if for whatever reason Trump isn't there.
And he passed a bill in Florida that said that he didn't have to resign the governorship in order to run for president. So, he's doing a Vladimir Putin, isn't he? He's kind of rewriting the history books so that he can remain all powerful. And that's often the case, isn't it, with governors? We see this with Greg Abbott and, similar governors where they have this, they give the impression that they are all powerful in their state. But the moment they cross the border, then really they lose all jurisdiction.
Right. And I think a lot of that goes to it shows you how much at a state level the power of the party and the power of the apparatus. It isn't necessarily that these people are, sort of bona fide populist, deeply talented politicians. They are there and happen to have a willingness and being at the right place at the right time to align their interests with the party, with the money, with where, the various powers want them to go. So, Ron, and that's part of the thing. Like, Donald Trump is charismatic. I mean, you may or may not like him, but he can go out there and talk to a crowd of people and make them feel like he gets them. Same thing with, but Ron DeSantis is not that. Greg Abbott is not that. So there's I think you make a great point that when you take some of these people out of a regional, local, state setting and you put them on a national stage, be careful, because I don't think either of those folks have a demonstrated track record of being able to garner sort of national appeal. And I think that was the report card on DeSantis when he got done with his sort of world tour and goes dipping his toe around the United States.
What is it with his brand of extremism? This idea, I mean, at the moment, the current kind of the new flavor of racist is trans people, right? So the prejudice against the trans community, and obviously his fight with Disney, which is so foolish, and their lawyers keep whooping him at every opportunity. It's very, even if he doesn't make the primary and doesn't make the presidency and goes back to the governorship, the damage that is done in the meantime on the journey of the campaigning, where they say all of this extreme rhetoric, it's so damaging, it's so dangerous, and the LGBTQ plus community are suffering in the same way that black and brown people have been suffering since forever because of this rhetoric and these dog whistles and, DeSantis, even in Florida, refusing to denounce a neo-Nazi rally. I mean, it's so damaging to American culture along the way, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, I think it is in many ways. There is at the core of this, I think, a perception of people feel they're losing power. People probably, in many cases, are coming from a perspective of feeling that they were and are superior. And superior to any number, superior to other races, superior to other religions, superior to other sexual orientation. And it is easier in many ways and more acceptable in mainstream culture if you speak out against gay pride or any LGBTQ plus sort of issue. It is easier to do that publicly than it is to stand up and say something that is, racially biased, saying something horrible about, blacks or Asians, or saying something about Jews or whatever the case may be. It is more acceptable to say hateful things when it is targeting sexual orientation or gender identity than it is these other categories. So the underlying urge is to speak ill about the other, identify the other as the cause of the evil, and there is a higher societal cost of doing that. I mean, there's the same feeling there. I mean, when you look and say, well, why is the trans community being targeted so much more? Well, it's not because there's an absence of racism. It's not because there's an absence of religious intolerance. That's there. It's just less acceptable to say it. I mean, you're not going to go in to a bunch of Target department stores and protest that, whatever it is, they have cosmetic products aimed at black consumers and get them pulled off the shelves. I mean, that's never going to happen, but you can go in there and protest Pride Month. And it works. And Target is pulling things off the shelf. So this intolerance broadly is there. I think it just happens to be erupting around sexual orientation and identity because that is, horribly enough, somehow more acceptable than it is in other expressions of intolerance. And it is, you're right. I mean, it is bad. All of this, the encouragement of that behavior, the, talking about, the grooming behavior and accusing people of, just horrible things really degrades the sort of civic discourse in the United States. And it's all, it's everybody, people throwing that up on social media. It's not, people still wouldn't go out on their neighborhood block party and say those sorts of things to their neighbor, but it's just easier to say that, to tweet about it or put something up on Facebook or Truth or wherever the case may be.
And the sad thing is that the trans people, I mean, I know plenty of trans people. I grew up with trans people. Often when these MAGA Republicans are asked, do you know any trans people? They don't. And so they're making a whole argument about a community that they've had no contact with. My experience of trans people is that they will do anything to fit in, to stay below the radar, to not draw attention. They are not they are not trying to turn people into, they're not trying to kind of recruit trans people in schools or anywhere else. And this is the thing that's so sad about it, is that anybody who is from a minority group understands how much physical and emotional effort they have to make to go under the radar and not to fall foul of racism or criticism or bigotry from white people. And DeSantis is encouraging this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and not just DeSantis. I mean, I think you have a huge swath of the Republican Party that is, unfortunately, encouraging this. It is not inclusive. It is the opposite. It's exclusive. It is encouraging divide. It is encouraging conflict. It is dehumanizing. It is taking, rather saying we're all people and, part of a greater whole, the great melting pot of America. It is saying we are opposites. We are different. They are inhuman. And then, you start dehumanizing people. You start identifying them as the cause of the problem. And this, this plays into, the increase in violence. I mean, the going down the path of saying there is a problem. The problem is created by the other isn't human. And then all of a sudden you have the radical communists on the left who aren't even people, and because they're all groomers, it makes it easier to engage in violence. It makes it easier to say they aren't human, therefore their vote shouldn't count, therefore they aren't. It just is a terrible path. It is such an anti-democratic path, and it is just, the problem is it isn't just Ron DeSantis in Florida. You see people, Marjorie Taylor Greene and MAGA, you just see, and you go turn on Fox News and you see it coming out of the mouths of, various of their anchors. And so it's not an isolated one or two person saying this. You have an embrace of it sort of across the spectrum of political leadership and media leadership, and frankly, community and faith leadership in some cases. So all the sources of authority, if you are of a certain political persuasion, whether it's your politicians, whether it's where you go to worship, whether it is, the people that you look to in the community as leaders, they're all, whether you turn on the television, they're all engaging in this behavior. And it's hugely worrisome.
And it spreads around the world. I mean, I think that's what some Americans fail to realize. In the same way that the global recession of 2008, caused by that subprime mortgage market in the US, let's say America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, and it's happening now. I mean, there was a video I saw on Thursday or Friday of a trans woman in Italy being beaten by 3 police officers. I mean, it was the most violent thing I'd seen. It was horrific, and it was filmed from above by a neighbor. And, this is something that, the effect of Trumpism, it spread to Brazil with Bolsonaro. We see it in Hungary with Viktor Orban. This rise of the far right, giving legitimacy to these types of characters because it worked out in America, because it became a thing in America. And if it's good enough for America, then it's good enough for the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, it's horrible to think about, but it's like, the rise of America as a net exporter of violent extremism. I mean, we would look, we spent the past 20 years going after saying, looking at, the Saudis and where, what are the sources of radical, violent Islamic terrorism? Well, now, what are the sources of radical, violent, white supremacist ideology? Well, the United States is at the top of the heap. I mean, you look to what not only people are doing within that regard in the United States, but the things they're saying, the things they're posting online, what folks are listening to and watching, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Oceania, whether, wherever in the world you are, if you tune in and start looking at what is coming out of the American, far right violent extremists, it is, the United States is becoming a net exporter of that sort of, violent ideology. So, there needs to be a real sort of introspection in a very serious, hard way. And I don't think a good, and again, I think there are a lot of Republicans who understand and want to do that, but there's a huge chunk who don't see it as a problem or who are completely unaware that there's anything wrong with it. So I don't know how we get a national dialogue about that. I know we aren't going to have that dialogue with a second Trump presidency DeSantis presidency. So, there's a lot coming up, and, where America lands in that dialogue over the next few years, we'll see.
Okay. Peter Strzok, thank you for joining The Weekend Show.
Great. Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast. And don't forget to support me and independent journalism on patreon.com/5Minute News. Subscribe to my daily podcast. It drops every morning. It's called 5 Minute News. You can hear what's happening around the world while you make your morning coffee. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.